Welcome back to Classic Car Restoration. Our 1962 Thunderbird Sports Roadster project car has been sitting in long-term hibernation for who knows how long. The paint's a little bit dull and dingy looking, but we've washed it, and the good news is our next expert seems to think we can save the paint. Here to help us do that is Kevin Tates from painteducation.com. And Kevin, thanks for coming out. Now, when you were here last, you told us about some ways to properly store a car. Is the paint situation on our Thunderbird due to improper storage, or is it just old paint?
Well, actually, it's a combination of both, Steve. The improper storage and the age, the amount of time that it was stored, both contributed to the dulling look that we've got on our car.
Kevin's plan for our car is to color sand it to remove the oxidation from the surface of the paint. Then he'll buff the finish out so it's as shiny as it was when the car was new. Before he starts, he uses some sample fender pieces to demonstrate important paint finish tests.
Now, before we can begin the color sanding process, which actually removes the oxidation layer on the top of the paint, you've got to determine what type of finish that we're dealing with. So we've got a couple of tests that we're going to show.
Kevin uses fine 600 grit sandpaper on the area using light fingertip pressure.
But you can see right here, the sanding that we've done reveals white sanding dust. So that tells us immediately that this is a clear-coated fender, and this is pretty safe. It's pretty strong, pretty safe to buff.
The sanding test on the next fender reveals red sanding dust, which means that it does not have a clear coat finish, and any color sanding on it might alter the finish. And the sanding test on the last paint sample also reveals colored sanding dust. Again, it's a pigment finish without a clear coat and could be damaged during the color sanding process. Next, Kevin tests the paint surface using lacquer thinner. He applies thinner to a rag and wipes the surface. On the first fender, no color residue is left on the rag, and there is no evidence that the finish has softened. The surface is slick and hard and can be color sanded. On the second fender, the thinner doesn't take the paint finish off, and the surface also remains slick, which tells us that even though this is a pigment finish, it is very stable and a hard color. It can be color sanded.
Now on this panel here, immediately we see black paint on the rag. The solvent has reflowed the paint, and this is a giant red flag.
Now we know that our Thunderbird has a base coat, clear coat type paint.
Absolutely,
so
yes.
We're safe to start color sanding.
We're good to go.
All right.
Okay. So what we're doing here is protecting our edges. We're making sure that we have that weak corner and that thin film on that corner protected from our buffer as it spins around.
And before any polishing can begin, we've got to remove the chrome trim from the car and the hood. Luckily, these older cars use nothing more complicated than basically trim nuts. You access these through the back of the fender. It's a 3/8 in this case, and these things come right off. As Kevin explains, the key to color sanding is using wet sandpaper and keeping the surface wet as you go. Kevin folds the sandpaper around a sanding block that has a soft and hard surface. We use the soft surface for our color sanding since we're just removing the thin top layer of the finish.
All we're after is trying to get that oxidized layer off, which brings me to the grit of the sandpaper. Color sanding paper goes anywhere from 600 grit all the way up to 4,000 grit. We're going to use 3,000 grit paper, which is almost like a notebook paper as far as what it feels like to your skin. And it's very, very non-aggressive as far as color sanding goes, because all it's doing is taking that top layer of oxidation off.
Kevin also adds a couple drops of mild dishwashing detergent to the sanding water to lubricate the surface and keep the paper pliable. Then Kevin sprays the soapy water over the surface and begins the color sanding process. He sands the surface in small circles using a gentle pressure. Then he uses a squeegee to remove the water and check his progress.
So now we can see where we've sanded. And we can actually track our color sanding. You can actually see the sanding marks. And it comes up at just a slightly different gloss.
Okay. Kevin continues with the color sanding process, spraying the area with soapy water and using the 3,000 grit sandpaper in small circular strokes. He squeegees the water off and dries it with a clean towel. Once the finish is color sanded as necessary, Kevin moves on to the buffing process. He prefers to use an electric buffer, which has a Velcro surface on which he can apply a thick foam buffing pad.
Okay, we're doing a two-step compound on our patch here. What that means is we're going to be aggressive with the rubbing compound and follow it by a machine glaze. And then, of course, you can do a wax or a hand glaze or whatever you prefer to really just do the finish out finish.
Kevin applies a small dot of rubbing compound directly to the hood, Then he primes the foam pad and surface with plain water.
You want to prime your pad, and you want to prime your surface just a little bit. Don't saturate it, but prime it. And that decreases your dry-on-dry contact, which will create swirl marks and scratches.
He sets the buffer on the lowest speed and buffs the surface using no body pressure, letting the buffer and the compound do the work. Before moving on to the next buffing stage, Kevin cleans the area using glass cleaner to remove any of the buffing compound and residue. Then he changes the buffing pad to a thinner and finer grade pad, which will complete the polishing process. And again, he sprays the area and the pad with water, and this time he applies a finer finishing glaze compound and starts polishing, again on a low speed.
And again here, just like before, you don't want to dry buff, so you want to monitor your surface.
Kevin also suggests that you do a second application to completely polish the surface and fill in the scratches. Then lastly, he uses a microfiber polishing cloth to finish the job.
Well, our Thunderbird's paint is almost as nice as it was in 1962, thanks to Kevin and his ability to finesse what we already had. We almost went to the expense and time delay of stripping and painting this car, but thankfully we didn't have to. Now, we do have some other paint problems. We have some stone chips, and we'll show you how to handle those when we come back. Welcome back to Classic Car Restoration. Kevin Tates from PaintUcation.com is here to show us some classic paint blemish repairs that can be done with a simple paintbrush.
That's right, Steve. What we've got represented here are probably your common most damaged areas on a panel. You've got a scratch and you've got rock chips. And we're going to show you some really effective ways to fix this stuff. What we're going to use is the correct ratio, the correct color, and it's going to set and blend in naturally with the rest of the finish. Now, the way we do that is by getting a pre-mixed color from our paint jobber store matched to the code of the car.
Okay, and that data comes from the trim tag, the paint code on the car?
Exactly right. There's a paint code associated with every car, or the VIN number will get you that as well.
Okay.
Kevin prepares the paint, which is a two-part solution of paint and a catalytic hardener, which will make the paint very durable. After pouring the parts into separate containers, he can easily mix a small amount of the paint using eyedroppers. The ratio is 4 parts paint to 1 part hardener. Using a small modeler's paintbrush, Kevin adds a small drop of paint onto the chipped area.
And on our scratch, we're going to do the same thing. And the paint will stay taller. It'll fill in the scratch. It's like filling in a ditch. But what we're going to do next, we'll show how to level this stuff and make it blend in with the outside finish. If you happen to have rust in your chips, this is another great tool. These things are the best thing to have around a shop.
And what are they?
It's just a single-edge razor blade, and you can scrape the rust out with this and wipe it clean, and you've just prepped your panel to where you're not going to be putting paint over top of rust. All right, now here we've got a repaired panel. We've got the paint that's dried overnight, and it's filled in the scratches and the rock chips. So now it's a sort of a bulbous-looking repair, and on these top panels, we're going to show you how to level it. So what we've got here is a single-edge razor blade, and we're actually going to scrape this down. But there's a way to dress this blade using 1,000 grit paper. You scrape it one direction.
And the objective here is to make it sharper?
To make it sharper, we're creating a burr on the upper edge of that blade, and that creates a really smooth 1,000 grit surface to scrape our run. So we don't get any burrs that are inherent in the blade. We're just basically dressing that blade down to make it consistent.
Okay.
Then, keeping it in the same position, we're bending a slight U shape in it. And what that does is when we scrape our places, the edges of this blade stay off of the panel, and we've got a nice U shape to level our defect.
Kevin uses the modified razor blade to carefully scrape away the raised layer of repaired paint. He uses fingertip pressure and planes the area until it is flat.
So now we've got that rough down flat. Now we're going to take our 1,000 grit paper again, which is already lubed,
That's
and
right.
we're going to stay really localized to that chip.
Okay.
So now we've got that completely leveled.
It's vanished.
It's
More-
vanished,
more or less.
absolutely. But we're still not ready to compound it out yet.
Okay.
We're going to use 2,000 grit paper.
Which is a finer grade.
Absolutely, it's a finer grade, and you can feel that. It's almost like notebook paper. It's very non-aggressive, and we're still staying real local to that rock chip. Just fingertip pressure. And that ought to be good enough to buff and polish out.
Then all Kevin has to do is buff the sanded areas out. As before, he uses the polishing compound and the foam buffing pad, buffing at low speed.
We'll just give that a quick rub. And you'd follow this up with a finessing pad and then a hand wax over top of that. But you can see that's disappeared.
It's gone.
It's virtually gone.
Wow.
And that's invisible to the eye. You'd never know that was there before it started.
And the same would hold true for the scratch.
Absolutely. Just a little more care, just a little more time involved with that. And this is something that anybody can do. This is very easy to do.
Well, we've just seen some excellent ways to repair stone chips and scratches on the car using a paintbrush and some very common hand tools.
For a complete review of Kevin's techniques for repairing paint chips and scratches on your car, visit our website at DIYnetwork.com.
Next, we're going to get into our Thunderbird's exterior and replace the trim. We'll do that when we come back. Car restoration. When we bought our 62 Thunderbird Sports Roadster project car, it was in pretty good condition, but it had some obvious problems with the exterior chrome and trim. Now, when it came down to the front and the rear bumpers, they had a pretty severe case of rust. In some cases, there was actually holes. We can see them right here. And generally speaking, the chrome is bleached out, flaking, and pitted. Now, while you can have bumpers like this rebuilt, welded again, ground, and re-chromed, it is not cheap. And if you do happen to find a chrome shop, remember that it takes a while, and you want to have them create an inventory of everything you bring to them so you get it back.
To avoid all that trouble, we bought some reconditioned chrome bumpers from an internet website specializing in vintage Thunderbird parts.
When it came to the body stainless on our Thunderbird, much of it was usable with a little bit of polishing. All we had to do was go onto a bench grinder, use a cotton polishing wheel and some rouge, and basically just a couple of hours of elbow grease, we had them back. In some cases, though, the stainless was bent, or the cast pot metal parts were too badly pitted for reuse. So again, we went onto the internet and bought some reproduction parts as well as some good reconditioned original parts to bring our car back into shape. One major eyesore that we have to deal with before we change the bumpers are these rubber fender end caps. These go between the car and the bumper, and the originals are pretty well dry rotted and quite a mess. So what we're going to do is replace them with brand new ones from the reproduction aftermarket.
To do that, I loosen and remove the headlight bolts and pull the entire headlight out. I won't disconnect it, I just let it hang carefully so I can get to the rubber caps. Then it's just a matter of removing the bolts that hold the rubber in place and peeling the old rubber off. The new rubber goes on and I secure it with the bolts. The last bolts go on and the installation is complete and I can reinstall the headlight. And I do the same on the other corners of the car, installing each new rubber cap.
And that's all set. Little details like this make a big difference in any restoration.
Before attaching the fender molding, I need to install the plastic fender bumpers and the metal retaining clips. These are simply hammered into place. And the new molding goes on, inserting the tip screw fastener into the front locking clip and then carefully pounding the molding onto the retaining clips along the fender by hand. And the new molding looks great. A new Thunderbird fender emblem goes on by simply snapping it into the retaining holes. And a new Sports Roadster ornament also goes on, snapping it into place. Details like these really add to the car's authenticity. Installing the heavy Thunderbird bumpers is not a one-person job. Kevin Tates and Keller Wallace helped me lift it into place. And we start securing it. The bumper attaches to the frame from underneath the car. We also found some new vent trim for the quarter panels of the car. These simply fit into the holes and are secured from inside the trunk using locking nuts. And the last thing I do is attach the hood emblem to the shiny new hood. The emblem is secured underneath the hood with locking nuts.
Wow. We've turned an important corner in the restoration of our 62 Thunderbird Sports Roadster. You know, it's true what they say about first impressions, and now with decent paint and good chrome and bumpers, this Thunderbird looks like $1 million and will turn heads when we drive it. But we're not done yet. On the next episode of Classic Car Restoration, we're going to dig in and keep going.